Every woman who walked through that gate left within a week. Hector said it like a warning. Every single one. Evelyn Hart picked up her satchel anyway. She had walked 3 miles in a Wyoming blizzard to get here. She had left behind 6 years of marriage to a man who thought silence was something you could beat into a person. She had crossed 2 territories alone with nothing but a torn coat and 14 documents that could bring down half the land office in Wyoming. She was not afraid of a cold man. She knocked on the gate and waited. When Caleb Mercer opened it, she looked straight at him and said, "Do you have work for someone who has nothing left to lose?" If this story already has you, drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me all the way to the end. Because what happens between these 2 people is going to surprise you. Everyone in Red Hollow, Wyoming knew the rules about Caleb Mercer before they knew anything else about him. You did not ask about his past. You did not linger near the north fence where the old graves were. You did not try to make him laugh at supper. And if you were a woman, any woman, you did not make the mistake of thinking you were the one who would finally change him. Because they all thought that. Every single one of them. And every single one of them was wrong. Margaret Hollis, the banker's daughter from Cheyenne, lasted 4 days before she rode back to her father in tears and refused to speak about what happened. Clara Vance, a wealthy widow with land of her own and nothing left to prove, stayed exactly 6 days, packed her things with the quiet fury of a woman who had finally understood something terrible and never set foot in Red Hollow again. There were others. Women who came with hope stitched into the hems of their good dresses. Women who had heard Caleb Mercer owned the finest working ranch in all of Wyoming territory, 3,000 acres, 100 head of cattle, a bunkhouse full of loyal men who had worked for him since before the bad years. Women who figured that a man with all of that couldn't possibly be as empty as the rumors said. The rumors were not exaggerated. Caleb Mercer, at 38 years old, was a man who had made a private agreement with himself somewhere around the age of 30 and never broken it since. The agreement was simple work, was honest, land was real, and people, especially women, would leave you eventually. So the intelligent thing to do was never give them anything worth taking when they went. He wasn't cruel. That was the thing people struggled to explain when they talked about him. He paid his ranch hands on time and fairly. He helped neighboring families during hard seasons without being asked. He kept his word in every business arrangement he ever made. There wasn't a man in Fremont County who'd been cheated by Caleb Mercer, and there wasn't a woman who'd been spoken to harshly by him either. He was simply absent. Emotionally, completely, deliberately absent. The men who worked his ranch, Hector the foreman, a barrel-chested man from Texas with 20 years of ranch work in his hands. Young Denny, barely 19 and still trying to figure out how adults were supposed to behave. And old Pete, who'd been fixing fences and asking no questions since before Caleb's hair started going gray at the temples. They had their own theories. None of them said it out loud, but they all knew the name that explained it. Rose Calloway, Caleb's fiancée. Dead 7 years now during the famine winter that killed almost a quarter of Red Hollow's population and all of Caleb's ability to feel anything he wasn't willing to put into the ground afterward. The night Evelyn Hart appeared at his gate, Caleb had come in from a 12-hour day, checking fence lines in 20-degree wind. His coat was stiff with cold. His hands ached in the particular deep way that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with age. He was 40 steps from his front door, thinking about nothing except coffee and the ledger he needed to finish before morning when he heard the knock at the outer gate. He stopped. Nobody knocked at that gate at this hour. Nobody came out to the Mercer property after dark, unless something had gone wrong on one of the neighboring ranches, and even then, they came on horseback with urgency behind them. This knock was different. Slow. Deliberate. Like a person who had already decided not to be afraid of the answer. Caleb walked to the gate and opened it. She was standing in the dark in a coat that had no business keeping anyone warm in Wyoming in November. Brown wool torn at the left shoulder, patched twice at the cuffs with different colored thread. She was carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had been repaired with whatever was available rather than whatever matched. She wasn't young late 20s, maybe 30, with dark hair pushed back under a plain hat and eyes that took him in with a steadiness that most people reserved for things they were trying not to be frightened of. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain. She just said it. "Do you have work for someone who doesn't belong anywhere anymore?" Caleb stared at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" he said. "Evelyn Hart." She said her name the way a person states a fact they're no longer willing to apologize for. "Where did you come from?" "East." "East is a big place." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked past her at the dark road. No horse, no wagon, no companion waiting at a distance. Just the wind coming across the open plain, and this woman standing in it like she'd grown there. "You walked here." "From the road junction." That was 3 miles in the dark and the cold. Caleb felt something shift slightly in his chest. Not softness, not yet, but something closer to the specific gravity of a fact he couldn't dismiss. "There's no hotel in Red Hollow that'll have women traveling alone," he said. "Mrs. Alcott at the boarding house said she wasn't taking anyone without a letter of recommendation." A pause. "I don't have a letter of recommendation. Most people who show up at a stranger's ranch in the dark don't." "I'm not asking to stay," she said. "I'm asking for work. If you don't have any, I'll keep moving." Caleb looked at her for another moment. The satchel, the coat, the total absence of performance in her voice. No flirtation, no plea, no attempt to make herself appealing or pitiable. She was simply standing there offering a transaction, waiting for a yes or a no, the way a person waits for weather. "What kind of work do you know?" he said. "Cooking, mending, inventory and supply organization, some accounting. I can read and write in 2 languages. I'm good with animals." A brief pause. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't require conversation." That last thing was what did it. He would think about that later, the specificity of it, the way she offered it, not as charm, but as practical information. Something a person mentions because they understand it matters. "There's a spare room off the kitchen," Caleb said. "Stove's still warm. I pay honest wages for honest work. You'll eat with the hands." "That's fine." "I don't know anything about you." "No," she said. "You don't." He opened the gate wider and stepped back, and Evelyn Hart walked into the Mercer Ranch with her torn coat and her battered satchel, and her eyes that had already decided not to show him what they'd seen. Caleb told himself it was a practical decision. The ranch needed a cook since old Mrs. Prentice left in September. That was all it was. Practicality. He told himself that for the rest of the week. He almost believed it by the end. The first thing Evelyn did the following morning was wake before anyone else and rebuild the kitchen fire from ash. Hector found her there at 5:30, kneading dough on the work table with her sleeves rolled up and a pot of something already smelling like it had been cooking for hours. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, hat in hand, not sure what protocol applied to mysterious women who appeared at the boss's gate in blizzard season. "Morning," Evelyn said without turning around. "Morning," Hector said carefully. "You're the new cook," she said. "Evelyn, there's coffee on the left burner. Help yourself." Hector poured himself a cup, tasted it, and felt immediately that this was the best coffee made on this property since before he could remember. "That's ma'am, this is good coffee." "I know," she said simply. He stood there another moment. "The boss tell you where things are kept." "I found them." Hector glanced around the kitchen. Every cabinet was slightly open, as if she'd worked her way through each one in sequence, cataloging contents. A list sat on the corner of the work table, neat handwriting organized by category: what was present, what was nearly gone, what was absent altogether, and presumably needed. Hector looked at the list for a moment. "You made an inventory." "It seemed useful." "Before breakfast." "I was awake." Hector took another sip of coffee and decided that whatever the story was behind this woman, it wasn't his business, and the coffee was exceptional, and those two facts together were enough for him. Caleb came downstairs at 6, the same as always. jacket already on expression, already settled into that particular closed-off blankness. His men had stopped trying to penetrate years ago. He stopped at the kitchen doorway when he smelled the food. Evelyn set a plate on the table without looking at him. Eggs, bread, salt pork, and something with dried herbs that had no business being this fragrant in November on a working ranch. "You didn't have to," he started. "You pay me to cook," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He ate in silence. She went back to the work table and resumed whatever she was making. She did not try to talk to him. She did not glance over to see if he was enjoying it. She simply worked methodical and unhurried, as if his presence in the kitchen was a neutral fact rather than an occasion. It was so foreign to him that he sat there 3 minutes after he'd finished eating before he remembered to stand up. "The list on the corner," she said as he reached the door. "The supplies. If you have an account at the general store in town, most of that can be ordered. The ranch is low on more than people probably noticed." He looked back at her. "How long did that list take you?" "About an hour, after I organized the dry storage." He stared at her. "You reorganized the dry storage. It was arranged by size. That's not useful. It's organized by category now. Grains, preserved goods, salt and spice, medical supplies." She turned briefly. "I separated the medical supplies because they were mixed in with the food goods, and that's how accidents happen." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Send the list to Harmon's store," he said finally. "Tell them to put it on my account." He walked out. And he spent the next 2 hours thinking about that list and the medical supplies and the way she'd said, "That's how accidents happen," not as a criticism of how things had been run before, but as a simple statement of logic, the way a person talks when they've been paying careful attention to the world for a long time and have learned that details matter. By the end of the second week, strange things started appearing around the ranch. Small things, easy to miss if a person wasn't paying attention. But Caleb paid attention to everything that happened on his property, and he noticed. A cracked handle on the water pump near the barn, wrapped tight with new leather cord, and no longer in danger of splitting a man's hand open mid-use. The ledger he'd left on the desk, with 3 months of entries crowded and difficult to follow. Separated now into a second book, the entries transferred in a clean hand with a margin column he hadn't thought to include, but immediately understood was useful. Wildflowers dried and brown this time of year, collected from wherever she'd found them, placed in a small tin cup beside the 2 graves at the north edge of the property. His parents. No one had set anything beside those markers since Caleb's mother died 12 years ago. He'd stopped going near them himself because standing there did something to him he didn't want to examine. He found her there one evening at dusk, standing a few feet from the graves, with her hands clasped in front of her, not praying exactly, just present, like a person who knew what it meant to stand somewhere difficult and not run from it. He stopped a distance back. She didn't turn around. "I hope that's all right," she said without turning. "I didn't know them. I just thought it seemed like someone should." Caleb said nothing. "I can move the flowers if you'd rather." "Leave them," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He turned and walked back toward the house. But he stopped once and looked back briefly in a way he made sure no one saw. Ching. The nights were the thing he hadn't accounted for. Caleb had spent 7 years with evenings that went the same way, supper with his men. A brief conversation about the following day's work, and then an hour or 2 alone in the study with the ledger or whatever practical problem needed solving before sleep. Silence. Always silence by 8 o'clock, and he'd come to prefer it. Silence asked nothing of him. Silence did not watch him, or want things from him, or remind him of what he'd stopped being. But now there was a light in the kitchen after supper. He didn't mean to notice. He noticed anyway. The first night he walked past and kept walking. Second night, same. Third night he stopped outside the kitchen door and stood there listening to the sound of pages turning. She was reading, just reading alone at the kitchen table with a cup of something steaming beside her, and a book open in front of her, and the fire low, and the lamp turned up just enough. He pushed the door open. She looked up. No surprise, no adjustment of expression to welcome him or perform comfort. She just looked at him, the way a person looks when someone enters a room. They share a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. "Is there something you need?" she said. "Coffee," he said. He didn't particularly want coffee. She set her book face down and stood and poured him a cup, and set it on the table, and sat back down and picked up her book again. As if this were ordinary. As if men who hadn't sat in their own kitchen after dark in 7 years did it all the time. Caleb sat down across from her. He drank his coffee. She read her book. After a while, without looking up, she said, "Horses or mountains?" He looked at her. "What? If you had to choose something to look at for the rest of your life, horses or mountains?" He stared at her. "That's a strange question." "I ask strange questions when I'm reading, and something in the book makes me think of one." "What were you reading?" She turned the cover toward him. It was a book of geography maps and descriptions of territories and their landscapes. "Mountains," he said after a moment. She nodded and went back to reading. "Why horses or mountains?" he said. "Because those are the two things men out here seem to love without embarrassment," she said simply, still reading. "I was curious which one you'd choose." Caleb sat with that. He drank his coffee. The fire settled. "What would you choose?" he said. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. "Rain," she said finally. "That wasn't one of the options." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She turned a page. He almost smiled. He caught it before it reached his face and turned it back into something neutral, but it had been there for half a second, like a match struck in a dark room, and he felt the warmth of it in his chest long after it was gone. He finished his coffee and went to bed. He came back the next evening without thinking about it, and the evening after that. Tuptiek. It was Hector who first said something out loud, because Hector was the only man on the property who had known Caleb long enough to notice what no one was supposed to notice. He found Caleb at the corral 3 weeks after Evelyn arrived, running a young horse through its paces in the cold morning, and he leaned against the fence and watched for a few minutes before saying carefully, "She's settling in all right, Miss Evelyn." "Fine," Caleb said, not looking up from the horse. "Men think she's a good addition. Denny said she helped him wrap that sprained wrist last week. Pete says the bunkhouse food's improved noticeably since she started sending meals over." A pause. "You seem—" Hector chose the next word very carefully. "Less aggravated than usual this past couple of weeks." Caleb shot him a look. "I'm just saying," Hector said, holding both hands up. "Don't." "Wasn't saying anything." "Good." Hector stayed at the fence another moment. "She's different from the others," he said, quieter now. "The ones who came before. She's not trying to get anything." Caleb said nothing. "I've been watching people a long time," Hector said. "Woman like that who doesn't want anything that's either the most honest thing in the world, or it's the thing you should be most careful about." Caleb ran the horse through another circuit. "You done?" he said. "Yeah," Hector said. "I'm done." But he wasn't wrong, and Caleb knew it, and that knowledge sat in the back of his chest like a coal that refuses to stop glowing no matter how much cold air you throw at it. He didn't know yet which kind of woman Evelyn Hart was. He didn't know yet that she was asking herself the exact same question about herself. And he didn't know not yet that somewhere back east, a man who was supposed to be dead was already asking questions about where she'd gone. The thing about Caleb Mercer that nobody in Red Hollow ever fully understood was this: he wasn't cold because he didn't feel things. He was cold because he felt them too much and had spent 7 years building a system to make sure nobody ever found that out. The system had worked perfectly until Evelyn Hart sat across from him in his own kitchen and asked him whether he preferred horses or mountains, and then ignored his answer in favor of rain, which wasn't an option, and somehow that was the most honest conversation he'd had in years. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He worked harder. He was out at the corral by 4:30 the next morning, a full hour before his usual start, because the alternative was lying in the dark, thinking about a woman who read geography books alone by firelight and didn't ask him for anything. Hector found him there when the rest of the men were still pulling on their boots. "You didn't sleep," Hector said. It wasn't a question. "Fence line on the east pasture needs checking," Caleb said. "The cold last week may have heaved some posts. I can send Denny. I'll go myself." Hector watched him saddle his horse with the particular focused intensity of a man who is doing a physical task to avoid a mental one. He knew better than to say anything else. He handed Caleb his gloves without comment and stepped back. But that evening, when Caleb came back stiff and cold, and 3 hours later than necessary for a fence inspection, the kitchen lamp was already lit. And he stood outside the door for exactly 4 seconds before he pushed it open. Evelyn was at the stove. She turned when she heard him assess the state of his frozen coat-set jaw, the look of a man who had been arguing with himself all day and lost, and said, "Sit down. I'll heat something up." "I'm not—" "You're cold, and you didn't eat lunch," she said. "I asked Hector." He stopped. "You asked Hector?" "I wanted to know if you'd be back for supper. He said you left early and didn't take anything with you." She moved the pot to the hot burner. "That's not a mystery to solve, it's just information." Caleb sat down. He didn't know why he kept doing that. She told him to sit, and he sat like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he hadn't spent the last decade making every decision on this property and answering to nobody. She set a bowl in front of him, something thick with venison and dried onion and whatever she'd found in the cellar that morning. "This is from yesterday's leftover," she said, sitting back down across from him with her own cup. "It's good." "I know." She said it without vanity, just the flat confidence of someone who'd been good at something for a long time and had stopped pretending otherwise. He found he didn't mind it. He found he minded very little about her in ways he was not ready to examine. "You're not going to ask where I went today?" he said. She looked at him over her cup. "No. Most people would. I'm not most people." "No," he said. "You're not." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away. And that was when he noticed for the first time clearly that whenever the conversation landed too close to something real, she was the one who moved away from it. Not him. Her. As if she had her own system, her own walls built from different materials than his, but just as deliberately constructed. He filed that away and said nothing about it. By the end of November, the ranch had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss. Denny, who'd had the kind of teenage awkwardness that made mealtimes a source of low-grade anxiety for everyone involved, had started eating breakfast with something approaching ease, because Evelyn talked to him like a person rather than a problem to manage. She asked him specific questions, not polite questions, specific ones. What part of Texas had he grown up in? Whether his family ran cattle or farmed? What he wanted to do when he'd saved enough from ranch wages to have options. Nobody had ever asked Denny what he wanted to do when he had options. And the first time she did, he sat there with his fork halfway to his mouth for a full 3 seconds before answering. Pete, who had perfected the art of silent survivorship across 30 years of ranch work, started leaving small things in the kitchen for her. A jar of wild honey he'd been saving. A piece of carved wood, a rough horse figure, the kind of thing he made in the evenings for his own hands to have something to do. He left it on the work table without explanation, and Evelyn put it on the windowsill without making a thing of it, and Pete spent the next week glancing at it when he thought no one was watching. Hector said nothing. But he watched all of it with the careful attention of a man who had seen this property in every season for 15 years, and knew the way old hands know things that something was shifting underneath the ordinary surface of the days. And Caleb. Caleb started doing something he hadn't done in longer than he could accurately remember. He started noticing things, not the practical things. He'd always noticed those. The fence post that needed replacing, the calf that was weaning too slow, the supply account that was running light before spring. Those things he noticed as automatically as breathing. No. He started noticing other things. The way Evelyn's voice changed slightly when she talked about horses. Something warming in it, something that was almost enthusiasm, but careful about showing itself. The way she never raised her voice, not once, even on the morning when young Denny knocked an entire shelf of jarred goods onto the kitchen floor, and stood there, surrounded by broken glass, going pale with apology. She had said calmly, "Get the broom." And that was the end of it. The small scar on the inside of her left wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve. He'd noticed it once when she was reaching past him for something on the high shelf, and she'd pulled her sleeve down without acknowledging it, and he'd said nothing, because it wasn't his business, and because the shape of it told him something he wasn't ready to say out loud. The fact that she never not once left the property. Every other ranch hand in his memory had ridden into town on their off days for supplies for company for a drink at the Red Hollow Saloon. Evelyn asked for nothing from town, except the supplies on her list, and those she had Hector collect. One afternoon, he came into the kitchen to find her standing at the window, not looking out with the idle attention of someone watching weather, but standing still in a way that was different, tighter, the way a person stands when they hear something they weren't expecting to hear. He stopped. "What is it?" he said. She turned around. Whatever had been in her face a second before was gone, replaced by the usual steadiness. "Nothing," she said. "Thought I heard something on the road." He looked at her for a moment. "You expecting someone?" "No," she said. And then very precisely, "No one knows I'm here." The way she said it, the emphasis in it. Not relief, certainty, like a woman who had been careful about that fact and needed it to remain a fact. Caleb said, "All right," and let it go. But he didn't forget it. The first real conversation, the kind that peels something back, happened on a Thursday evening in the third week of December, when a hard wind came off the northern plains and rattled the whole house in a way that made sleep difficult for everyone. Caleb was at the kitchen table past midnight with the account ledger and a lamp turned low, because this was where he worked when he didn't want to be in the study and wasn't ready to admit why. He heard her on the stairs, not the heavy tread of someone startled awake, but the quiet, deliberate step of someone who'd already been lying awake and made a decision about it. She came into the kitchen, saw him, and stopped. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Working." She moved to the stove and put water on without asking, and sat down at the other end of the table with a blanket around her shoulders. "The wind," she said, not explaining further. "It'll pass," he said. "I know." A pause. "I just don't like being still when everything around me is loud." He looked up from the ledger. She wasn't looking at him, she was looking at the table, at her own hands, flat against the wood, and something about the honesty of the admission, the small, unguarded quality of it, landed on him differently than he expected. "You were married," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way the truth does when a person has been thinking something long enough. She looked up slowly. "What makes you say that?" "The scar on your wrist isn't from work," he said. "And a woman doesn't learn to go that still around people unless she learned somewhere that being noticed brought consequences." The water began to heat on the stove. Neither of them moved. "Yes," she said finally. "I was." "He's gone," Caleb said. He kept his voice flat, professional almost, like asking about weather or livestock. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something he didn't expect. "That depends on who you ask." He went still. "He's not dead," she said. "People believe he is. There was an accident, a fire at one of his properties, and everyone assumed. I didn't correct them." Her jaw tightened one small movement. "I should feel guilty about that." "Do you?" "No," she said simply. "I don't." "What did he do?" Caleb said. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't calm, the kind that is covering something that is not calm at all. Evelyn's hands pressed slightly flatter against the table. "He decided early in our marriage that everything I did and thought and wanted belonged to him," she said. "And when I forgot that when I had opinions or plans, or simply disagreed about something, he reminded me." She paused. "He was very thorough about reminding me." The wind hit the side of the house hard enough to rattle the window glass. Caleb closed the ledger. "How long?" he said. 6 years. "How did you get out?" He traveled frequently for business, railroad investments mostly. The last time he left, I took what I could carry, walked to the nearest town with a stage line, and kept moving until I ran out of money. She said it the way a person describes a route they traveled, factually, without the drama of it, which somehow made it worse than if she'd cried. I ended up at your gate. 3 miles in the cold, he said. 3 miles in the cold, she agreed. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had organized his dry storage by category because accidents happen, who left flowers at graves. Nobody visited, who asked him questions that weren't designed to get him to like her, but seemed to come from genuine curiosity about what he was actually like. This woman who had been surviving in the careful, systematic way of someone who learned a long time ago that survival required systems. "You're safe here," he said. It came out simpler than he intended, more like a statement of fact than a reassurance. Evelyn looked at him. Something moved in her face, not relief exactly, not gratitude, but something harder to name. Like a person pressing against a door they've kept locked for years, and finding it has more give in it than they expected. "I know," she said quietly. "That's what worries me." He didn't ask what she meant. He understood what she meant. The water boiled. She got up and made 2 cups and set one in front of him without asking, and sat back down, and they stayed like that for a while, not talking with the wind, doing what wind does, and the lamp burning low between them, and Caleb Mercer felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he was in the right room. It was Denny who accidentally cracked something open the following week, the way young people do bluntly, without malice, without any idea of the weight of what they've said until after it's already said. He was helping Evelyn bring in firewood from the side porch, stacking it against the kitchen wall, in the particular disorganized way of a 19-year-old who considers the job done when the wood is technically inside, and he said without preamble, "You know, before you came, Mr. Mercer ate supper in the study most nights, alone. Hector said he used to eat with everyone years back, before Miss Rose." Evelyn stopped moving. "Who's Miss Rose?" she said carefully. Denny looked up, registering immediately from her face that he may have wandered into something. She was going to marry him, before she died, during the big famine winter 7 years ago. Fever, I think. I wasn't here then, but Pete told me some of it. He shifted the wood in his arms uncomfortably. Hector says he wasn't always like this, says he used to laugh a lot. Evelyn looked at the stack of wood for a moment. "Denny," she said. "Ma'am, don't mention to Mr. Mercer that you told me that." Was that wrong of me to say?" She considered him. "No," she said. "It's just information that should stay between us." He nodded with the seriousness of a young person trusted with something. "Yes, ma'am." She carried the last of the wood inside and stood alone in the kitchen for a moment before going back to work. And something rearranged itself quietly in her understanding of this place and this man. The graves at the north fence, the empty chair at the head of the supper table, that he never sat in the study where he used to disappear at night to be alone with accounts that didn't require him to feel anything. 7 years. He'd been running this ranch alone and sealed for 7 years, and she understood, in the particular way of a person who had also built a life on the technique of absence, that the worst thing you can do for someone like that is try to force the door. You have to wait. You have to let them find their own way to it. The problem, the thing Evelyn had not fully accounted for when she arrived at his gate in a torn coat with nothing left to lose, was that she was starting to want him to find his way to it, and that wanting, that specific pull towards someone who was slowly, unconsciously becoming necessary to her days, terrified her in a way that Nathaniel Hart's fists never had. Because Nathaniel had only ever had the power to hurt her body. What Caleb Mercer was doing simply by being himself in the same space as her had the potential to do something much more dangerous. He could make her need someone again, and the last time she'd needed someone, it had cost her 6 years and a scar on her wrist, and 3 miles in the dark in a Wyoming blizzard. She picked up her next task and got back to work. Because that was what you did. You identified the risk clearly, you acknowledged it fully, and then you put your hands to something useful, and you kept moving. What she did not do, what she was not yet capable of doing, was examine the possibility that the risk might also be worth it. Three days before Christmas, Caleb did something that no one on the ranch expected. He came down for breakfast at his usual time, sat at his usual place, and then before Evelyn brought anything to the table, he said to the room to the men who were filing in for the morning meal, to no one, and all of them at once. "We'll take Christmas Day off work. Full day. Anyone who wants to ride into town for the celebrations, go ahead." Silence. Denny looked at Pete. Pete looked at Hector. Hector looked at the ceiling. "Full day," Denny said, as if Caleb had announced they were all growing wings. "You hard of hearing?" Caleb said. "No, sir." Denny smiled so wide it looked like it hurt. "No, sir, not at all." After the men filed out, Evelyn set a plate in front of Caleb and turned to go back to the stove, and he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "That was your doing." She paused. "I didn't say anything. You put pine branches on the mantel in the sitting room yesterday," he said, "and you didn't say anything about it, which meant you expected nothing to come of it." He picked up his fork. "I don't want you expecting nothing." She was still for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "It's just a day off," he said. "Don't make it something it isn't." But they both knew he was the one who'd just made it something. And somewhere in the cold territory northeast of Red Hollow, on a train heading west, a man who was supposed to be dead was unfolding a piece of paper with a description on it. A woman traveling alone, brown hair, a leather satchel, a torn coat repaired twice at the cuffs, and reading it for the fourth time with the particular cold focus of a man who is not angry yet, but is getting there. His name was Nathaniel Hart, and he was very much alive. Christmas came and went quietly on the Mercer Ranch, which was itself a kind of miracle, because nothing had come quietly to that property in years. Evelyn cooked a meal that made Pete set down his fork halfway through and stare at his plate as if he'd forgotten what food was supposed to taste like. Denny ate 3 portions and had the decency to look embarrassed about it. Hector produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been keeping for a special occasion for 2 years and said nothing about what made this occasion special, because some things are better left unspoken between men who understand each other. Caleb sat at the head of the table, the chair he hadn't used since before Rose died, and ate his supper in silence, but it was a different silence than the one his men had grown accustomed to. It was the silence of a man who is present, rather than the silence of a man who has made himself absent. Nobody mentioned it. Everyone noticed it. After supper, Caleb found Evelyn at the window holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. He stood beside her and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. And outside, the snow was coming down in that particular quiet way it does in Wyoming, when the wind has stopped and the world goes completely still and the only sound is your own breathing. "You should be somewhere warmer than this for Christmas," he said finally. She turned the cup in her hands. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He looked at her. She was looking out the window. He couldn't see her face clearly, just the shape of her profile in the lamplight, and something in that image lodged itself somewhere behind his sternum and refused to move. "Evelyn," he said. She turned then and looked at him directly, and whatever he'd been about to say dissolved, because she was looking at him the way a person looks when they're trying to memorize something they're afraid of losing. "Don't," she said softly. Not a rejection, something more careful than that. A person at the edge of a thing they know they can't yet survive landing in. He nodded. Once, and stepped back. And they stood there another moment in the strange charged safety of almost before she excused herself to finish the kitchen, and he walked out to check on the horses, which didn't need checking, but his hands needed something to do. That night was the last truly peaceful night either of them would have for a long time. Guy. The rumors started in town the way rumors always start, sideways from someone who wasn't supposed to be listening, but was. The first hint reached the ranch through Denny, who'd ridden into Red Hollow for supplies on a Tuesday, and came back with flour and salt pork, and a tight look around his mouth that had nothing to do with the cold. He found Hector in the barn and said low and quick, People in town are talking about Miss Evelyn. Hector straightened up from what he was doing. What kind of talking? Asking where she came from, whether she gave her right name. Somebody said a man came through asking questions about a woman matching her description, said she was his missing relative. Denny's jaw was tight. Didn't feel like a relative kind of question the way he was asking it. Hector said, "Did you see this man yourself?" "No, he was already gone. But Harmon at the general store said he was well-dressed and well-spoken and had two other men with him who weren't dressed as well and carried themselves like they were used to being the kind of trouble that doesn't apologize after." Hector stood very still for a moment. "Don't say anything to Evelyn," he said. "I'll talk to Caleb." "Should we be worried?" "We should be paying attention," Hector said carefully. "That's different from worried." But his face for the man who had spent 15 years being the calm center of every crisis on this property had gone to a place that was not entirely calm. He found Caleb in the study that evening and told him straight. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was normal. What was not normal was the way his hands went to absolute stillness on the desk in front of him. Not the controlled stillness he usually wore like a coat, but the stillness of a man processing something that is landing harder than he expected. "Description match," Caleb said. "Near enough from what Denny heard." "How long ago?" 3-4 days, according to Harmon. Caleb was quiet for the moment. "She told me her husband wasn't dead. She told me people only believed that." "So someone is looking for her." "Someone is looking for her," Caleb said. "And he didn't come alone." The silence that followed was the kind that makes decisions inside itself. "We don't say anything to her yet," Caleb said. "I want to know more before we put fear into this house." "Caleb, she's been afraid long enough," he said. His voice was even. "I want facts before I hand her something else to carry." Hector looked at him for a moment. He'd known this man since the hard years since the year Rose died, and Caleb became someone narrower than he'd been before. He recognized something in the face across the desk from him that he hadn't seen in a long time. He recognized investment. The particular dangerous human investment of a man who has started to care about an outcome that involves another person. He said, "All right," and left it there. Bye. 2 days later, Evelyn knew something was wrong. Not because anyone told her. Because she was a woman who had spent 6 years in a house where silence was a warning system, and she had learned to read the quality of quiet the way sailors read water. The way Hector's eyes moved to the road when he came in for breakfast. The way Denny answered her questions a half-beat too fast, with the eager helpfulness of a young person trying to compensate for something. The way Caleb, who had been finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings, suddenly had supper in the study 2 nights in a row. She waited until the 3rd night, and then she went to the study and knocked on the door. "Come in." She opened the door and stood in the frame and said, "Who came to town asking about me?" Caleb looked up from the ledger. His expression didn't change, which told her everything because a man who has nothing to hide doesn't hold his face that carefully. "Hector heard something," he said. "Tell me." "We don't have full information yet." "Caleb." She said his name the way she said things that mattered directly without ornament. "Tell me." He set down his pen. "A man, well-dressed with hired men with him, asking about a woman traveling alone matching your description. He told Harmon at the general store she was a missing relative." Evelyn stood very still. The color didn't leave her face. She was too controlled for that, but something shifted behind her eyes that was the opposite of surprise. "How long ago?" she said. 4-5 days. "He's not a relative," she said. "I know. And he's not going to stop." "Evelyn, you need to know something," she said. She came into the room then all the way in and sat down in the chair across from his desk, the way she'd sat across from him in the kitchen that first night directly without the performance of needing permission. "I didn't just leave because of what he did to me. I left because of what I took with me." Caleb went very still. She reached into the pocket of her dress and set something on his desk. A folded document, thick paper, official-looking, covered in small, handwritten columns that she could see him trying to read upside down. "There are more," she said. 14 in total in the satchel I brought. Those are copies. I made copies and hid the originals in 3 different places before I left." Her voice was steady and deliberate. "They are records of bribes paid to land office officials across Wyoming territory. Money paid to approve fraudulent land transfers ranching families forced off their property on forged legal claims, their land absorbed into railroad expansion." Caleb said nothing. "His name is Nathaniel Hart," she said. "He is a railroad investment partner. He is not dead. And those documents have enough in them to end his operation and put several federal officials in prison." The clock on the wall ticked. "You knew this when you came here," Caleb said. "Yes." "You were carrying evidence that could get you killed." "Yes." "And you knocked on my gate in the dark." I ran out of options before I ran out of Wyoming," she said. You were not on his map, not connected to the railroad men. Your land is west of the main acquisition corridor. I thought I would be safe long enough to figure out what to do next." Caleb picked up the document she'd set on his desk. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw shifted. Once. "These names," he said. "On the bribe records. Do you recognize any of them?" She leaned forward slightly. "Third column, 2/3 of the way down." His finger moved down the page and stopped. And then Caleb Mercer, a man who had controlled his emotional reactions for 7 years with the precision of someone who had practiced it into muscle memory, said one word under his breath that he would normally never say in front of a woman. He stood up from the desk. "That's Aldridge," he said. "David Aldridge. He's the land commissioner for this district." A pause. "He signed off on the boundary survey for my north pasture 18 months ago." Evelyn watched him. "Your land may not be as safe as you thought." "My neighbor Greer lost 40 acres in the fall," Caleb said, and his voice was doing something controlled and terrible. "I told him to get a lawyer. He said the paperwork was all in order. I believed him." "The paperwork is in order," Evelyn said. "That's how it works. Everything looks legitimate until you compare it to what it's replacing." He looked at her across the desk, and something in his face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not quite, but the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the enemy he wasn't looking for has been operating directly beside him. "How long have you been sitting on this?" he said. "I've had the documents for 8 months," she said. "I've been trying to find someone I could trust to bring them to." A pause that cost her something. "Federal investigators don't take meetings with women traveling alone without a husband's introduction. Lawyers require money I don't have. And everyone connected to the Territory Land Office is either on that list or afraid of someone who is." Caleb set the document back down on the desk. "You should have told me," he said. "I know," she said. "I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" She looked at him for a long, honest moment. "Because the last time I trusted someone with something that could destroy me, I spent 6 years paying for it." The room was quiet. "That won't happen here," he said. "I know that now," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now." He came around the desk and stood in front of her, and looked down at her with that face that was doing everything and showing almost none of it, and he said, "We're going to fix this, all of it." "It's not your problem to fix," she said. "Those are my neighbors' names on that list," he said. "And you are—" He stopped, started again. "You're on my property. That makes it my problem." She stood up, which put her close to him, and looked at him with something that wasn't quite steady. "Caleb," she said. "Don't tell me not to," he said. She didn't. Nathaniel Hart arrived on a Thursday. There was no warning, or rather, there was no more warning than what they already had, which in hindsight was plenty, but felt in the moment like nothing at all. 3 horses coming up the road in the early afternoon, 2 days after the first snow of January had frozen the ground solid. Caleb was at the corral. Hector saw them first from the upper field and got there fast enough that he and Caleb were both at the front gate, when the horses stopped. The man in front was perhaps 50, lean, well-dressed in the particular expensive way of someone who considers appearance a form of argument. Good coat, good boots. The kind of stillness in how he sat his horse that belongs to men accustomed to having people wait for them to speak first. The two men behind him were not there for company. "Caleb Mercer," the man said. "That's right," Caleb said. He did not open the gate. "My name is Nathaniel Hart. I'm looking for a woman named Evelyn, my wife. I believe she may be employed on your property." Caleb looked at him. "Your wife?" "We were separated some months ago. I've been concerned for her welfare." The voice was smooth and practiced, and carried exactly the right amount of husbandly worry. "She has a tendency toward instability. I want to bring her home where she's safe." "Instability," Caleb repeated. "She's not well," Nathaniel said. "Anyone who's spent time with her has likely noticed she can seem very capable, very rational. But she has episodes. She says things that aren't true. Believes things that aren't true." He paused deliberately. "I'm sure she's told you some story about why she left. Whatever she said, I can assure you the truth is considerably more complicated. Everything about the way this man spoke was a construction." Caleb understood that immediately, not because he was clever, but because he had spent 40 years watching men try to rearrange the facts of a situation with words, and he knew the smell of it, the way you know rain before it hits. "She hasn't mentioned you," Caleb said. Something moved very briefly in Nathaniel's expression. "She wouldn't. As I said, she's not well." "I'd like you to leave my property," Caleb said. Nathaniel smiled. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who has dealt with obstacles before and knows they eventually yield. "Mr. Mercer, I understand she may have made herself useful to you. I understand there may be a situation you feel some loyalty about. But she is my wife under the law, and I have legal standing to—" "You have no standing on my land," Caleb said. "Legal or otherwise. I'd like you to leave." The man to Nathaniel's right shifted his weight in the saddle. The movement was small and deliberate, the kind that is meant to be noticed. Nathaniel looked at Caleb for a moment. The patience in his smile thinned just slightly to something that was closer to its actual shape. "I'll give you a day," he said, "to think about the position you're putting yourself in. I'm not an unreasonable man, and I have no quarrel with you. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's shown you, there's context you don't have. I'd ask you to consider that before you make a decision you can't walk back from." "I've made my decision," Caleb said. Nathaniel held his gaze for another beat. Then he turned his horse. "One day," he said without looking back. "Think carefully." The three horses rode back down the road and were gone. Caleb stood at the gate and watched them out of sight and said nothing. Hector was beside him. "What do we do?" "Get the men in," Caleb said. "Tell Pete to check the gun cabinet. Tell Denny to stay close to the house. And Evelyn—" Caleb turned toward the house. "I'll talk to her," he said. She was in the kitchen when he came in, and she knew the moment she saw his face that they were out of time. "He was here," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's coming back," Caleb said. "Tomorrow, most likely." She turned away from the stove and faced him fully. He had expected fear he'd been bracing to absorb her fear to be the thing she held onto while it passed through her. Instead, he got something colder and more frightening than fear. She got purposeful. "The documents are in the satchel under my bed," she said. "I need to get them somewhere he can't access if—" "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said. "I wasn't suggesting I was. I'm saying the documents. I heard you. We'll move them tonight." He crossed the kitchen and stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. "What he said that you're unstable, that you have episodes, that whatever you've told me is a lie." She held his gaze. "Is that what he said?" "What he said to my face," Caleb said. "Yes?" She was very still. "And," she said, "and nothing," he said. "I'm telling you what he said because you have a right to know, not because I'm undecided." Something in her face broke just at the edges, just for a second. "Caleb, he's going to come back here with a story," Caleb said. He's going to tell me things that are designed to make me doubt everything you've said and everything I've seen for myself. And I need you to know right now, before any of that happens, that I'm not a man who requires a second opinion about a person I've been watching every day for 2 months." She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were doing something difficult. "He's good at this," she said. "He's been doing it a long time. He will find the right words to put in the right places, and you will start to wonder, Evelyn." His voice stopped her. "I've been running this ranch since I was 22 years old. I've dealt with men who lie for money, and men who lie for power, and men who lie because they've been doing it so long they've forgotten what the other thing feels like. I know what I'm looking at." She was quiet. "I know what I'm looking at," he said again, quieter. "On both sides of this." And there it was, the thing that had been building since December, since Christmas, since the kitchen and the rain and the geography book and the flowers on the graves. It was in the open now, not said exactly, but not hidden either, and both of them knew it, and neither of them moved. "You can't protect me from him by yourself," she said finally. Her voice was careful. "He has money and lawyers and men who do what they're paid to do without asking questions." "I know," Caleb said. "So what do we do?" "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to need you to trust me." She looked at him for a long time. And then Nathaniel Hart did something the next afternoon that none of them had fully anticipated, not the violence of it, which they'd expected, but the thing he said, standing in front of the Mercer Ranch gate, with the cold January sky overhead, that took a chisel to every fragile thing Caleb had allowed himself to feel for the first time in 7 years, and drove it straight through the center. Nathaniel Hart came back the next afternoon with 4 men instead of 2, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about how the conversation was going to go before a single word was said. He was at the gate already when they rode up Hector to his left. Pete just behind both of them, carrying the particular stillness of men who understand that what happens in the next few minutes matters. Caleb had his rifle resting across his forearm, not raised, not threatening, just present. A fact. Nathaniel pulled up and looked at the rifle, and then looked at Caleb, and smiled the same patient smile as before, and Caleb understood that this man had never in his life been afraid of another man's gun, because he had always had enough money behind him to make guns irrelevant. "I appreciate you coming out to meet me," Nathaniel said. "That tells me you're a reasonable man." "Tell me what you came to say, and then leave," Caleb said. "I came to collect my wife. She's not here to be collected." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Mercer, I've done some reading about you since yesterday. You've built a fine operation here. 3,000 acres, clean title, good reputation in the county." He paused. "It would be a shame to complicate that." "Meaning what?" "Meaning a man who harbors a woman against her husband's legal rights to bring her home puts himself in a particular kind of legal exposure, especially when that woman has been known to steal." Nathaniel said the last word with the precision of someone who has rehearsed exactly where to place it. Caleb said nothing. "She took property that belongs to me when she left." Nathaniel continued. "Documents. Private business documents that are my legal property. A court would call that theft. A court would also look very carefully at whatever she's told you about their contents given her documented history of—" "She doesn't have a documented history of anything," Caleb said. "You documented her. That's not the same thing." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. The patience didn't leave, but something behind it sharpened. "You think you know her," he said. "I know what I've seen." "You've seen 2 months," Nathaniel said. "I had 6 years." He let that sit for a moment. "She is very good at being exactly what a person needs her to be. I know that better than anyone. She came here, found a man alone, found what he needed, and became it. That's not love, Mr. Mercer. That is survival strategy. She used you the same way she used me until I became inconvenient." The words landed differently than Caleb expected. Not because he believed them, but because they were designed to land on the exact thing he was most afraid of, and Nathaniel Hart was a man who had done this before and knew precisely where to aim. "You think she came because she loves you." Nathaniel said quieter now, almost gentle, almost sympathetic. She came because she needed somewhere to hide. You were convenient. You were isolated. You were exactly the kind of man who could be managed with a little warmth and a lot of patience. Hector made a small sound beside Caleb. A warning. Caleb's jaw moved. Just once. "Get off my land," he said. "I'll go," Nathaniel said. "For now. But those documents are stolen property, and I will pursue recovery through any available legal channel. And when I do everything she's told, you will be examined in court, including whatever she may have said about me, which, given her history, I expect a judge will weigh accordingly." He turned his horse. "Think about what you're protecting, Mr. Mercer, and ask yourself whether she's worth what it's going to cost you." He rode away. The four men followed. The gate was still standing open, and Caleb was still standing in it, and Hector waited until the horses were far enough down the road before he said carefully, "You all right?" Caleb closed the gate. "Fine," he said. He wasn't fine. She was waiting in the kitchen. She'd heard the horses, heard the voices, couldn't make out the words, but understood the shape of the conversation from the length of it. When Caleb came through the door, she read his face in 1 second flat, the closed expression, the jaw, the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What did he say?" she asked. "That you took stolen property, and he intends to pursue it legally. The documents aren't stolen. They're evidence of crimes he committed." "I know that." "Caleb, I said I know that." He set his rifle against the wall. "He also said you came here because you needed somewhere to hide, and I was convenient." The kitchen went very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what you think?" she said. He didn't answer right away. That was the thing, the pause. The half-second where he was working something out in his own chest rather than just saying no immediately. And she saw it, and it hit her the way she'd known something like this would eventually hit her. "I think he knows how to find the right words for the right person," Caleb said finally. "And I think he's been doing this a long time, and he's very good at it." "That's not an answer to what I asked." "No," he said. "It's not." She held his gaze. "I came here because I had nowhere left to go. That is true. I won't lie about it." Her voice was steady. "But what happened after I got here, that wasn't strategy. I don't know how to make you believe that, and I'm not going to perform something to convince you of it." He looked at her. Something was working behind his face that he wasn't letting out. "I need to think," he said. "All right," she said, very quietly. "All right." He walked out. Hoy. The next 3 days were the longest of Evelyn's time on the Mercer Ranch. Not because he was cruel. He was never cruel. He was present and functional and spoke to her when spoken to and answered every practical question with practical answers. But the late evenings in the kitchen stopped. The small conversations that had been building themselves into something neither of them had named stopped. He came in for meals and left immediately after, and the particular warmth that had been growing in the ordinary routine of the place, that thing she hadn't wanted to need and had needed anyway, went cold. Denny noticed. He tried not to show it, but he kept looking between them at breakfast with the anxious expression of a young man who doesn't understand what went wrong but can feel the wrongness. Pete said nothing, but left a cup of coffee outside her door one morning, which was the Pete equivalent of an extended declaration of solidarity. Hector watched everything with the face of a man running calculations. On the second evening, Evelyn went to her room, took the satchel from under the bed, and sat on the floor with the 14 documents spread around her, and read them one more time. Not because she didn't know what was in them, because she needed to remember why she'd carried them this far. Why 6 years of a marriage that had systematically removed every part of herself she'd liked had been worth surviving. Why she'd walked 3 miles in a Wyoming blizzard. She picked up one document, running her finger down the column of names: the land commissioner, the assistant surveyor, 3 judges in 2 counties, and below them the ranch families: the Greers, the Pattersons, the Harlow family who'd had their land for 2 generations before the forged survey pushed them off. Names attached to real losses, real people, Real winters, without enough land to run enough cattle to keep families fed. She folded the documents carefully back into the satchel. She was not going to run again. She had decided that somewhere in the middle of the second sleepless night, and it had come to her not as an act of courage, but as a simple, flat exhaustion with the alternative. She was done running. Whatever happened next, she was done. She just hadn't figured out yet whether Caleb Mercer was going to be standing next to her when it did. It was Hector who told him. Not because it was his place. He would have told you himself honestly that it was not his place. But he had watched this man for 15 years, and he had watched a woman who had survived something that would have destroyed most people come into this house and make it feel like a home without being asked to. And he had reached the particular point of impatience that arrives when a person who should be able to see clearly is standing with their eyes closed. He found Caleb in the barn on the morning of the third day and said without preamble, "She has a scar on her wrist." Caleb looked at him. "I saw it when she helped me with the supply inventory last week," Hector said. "Old burn scar inside the left wrist. She covered it fast, but I've seen marks like that before. My sister had one. Husband held her hand over a stove for having an opinion he didn't like." His voice was flat. Not emotional, just accurate. "That's not a woman who ran because she was bored or because she wanted to manipulate somebody. That's a woman who ran because she finally could." Caleb was very still. "Denny told you about the wrist?" he said. "Nobody told me anything. I have eyes." Hector paused. "She's packing." Caleb looked up. "Not all of it. Not yet. But she reorganized her room last night. I could hear it through the ceiling. And this morning she put her good coat out on the chair instead of the hook where she usually keeps it." He met Caleb's eyes. "She's getting ready to leave before whatever happens next gives her no choice." The barn was quiet, except for the horses. "He beat her," Caleb said. "Not a question." "He did more than that," Hector said. "You can see it in how she's built herself. The way she controls every room she's in without letting anyone see her doing it. That's not personality. That's what happens to a person when they spend years where being in control of their environment is the difference between a bad day and a very bad day." He paused. "She's not a woman who needed somewhere to hide Caleb. She's a woman who needed somewhere to land." Caleb set down the piece of harness he'd been holding. He walked out of the barn without saying anything. Hector didn't follow. She was at the kitchen table when Caleb came through the door, not cooking, not reading, just sitting with her hands flat on the wood and her coat on the chair beside her, and she looked up when he came in and didn't pretend she hadn't heard him in the barn. "You talked to Hector," she said. "He talked to me," Caleb said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "The scar on your wrist. He told me what kind of scar that is." She looked at her hands on the table. The sleeve of her dress was covering her left wrist, as it always was. "It was a winter night," she said after a moment. "Our third year of marriage. I had written a letter to my sister without asking his permission. He thought I might have told her things he didn't want known." Her voice was level, factual, the voice of someone who has told a version of this story to themselves enough times that they can get through it without the thing inside it reaching their face. I hadn't told her anything. I had asked about her health and written about the weather. But he decided the letter itself was a demonstration of the kind of independent thinking he couldn't. She stopped. "I healed fine," she said. "I told the doctor I'd knock the lamp over." Caleb said nothing. His hands on the table were completely still, and if she'd looked at his face, she would have seen something that wasn't just anger. It was the particular anguish of a person looking at something that happened to someone they care about while they were somewhere else, unable to prevent it, and feeling the helplessness of that retroactively. "I should have told you more earlier," she said. "I know that. I kept thinking it wasn't my story to bring into your house. You'd already carried enough." "Evelyn." His voice was rougher than he intended. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. That's not why I'm telling you. I just want you to understand that whatever I've done in this kitchen and on this ranch, I did because it felt like something I could give back. Not as a strategy. Not to make myself useful enough that you wouldn't send me away. She stopped. I'm not very good at letting people I don't do well with. She exhaled. What I feel in this house is not something I manufactured. I want you to know that. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not reaching for her, not gripping, just covering her hand with his, the way a person does when there are no more useful words. She looked down at his hand, and then up at his face, and something in her own face, that careful steadiness she maintained like a structure she'd built to live inside, finally showed its seams. I was going to leave before he came back, she said quietly. I know, he said. Hector. Not Hector. I know you. He said it simply, not as a declaration, but as a fact he'd arrived at without noticing he was arriving at it. You were going to take the problem somewhere it couldn't touch us. You were going to make it your burden to carry alone because that's the only way you've ever known how to protect people you care about. Her jaw tightened. Is that wrong? You're not doing it alone, he said. That's all. Nathaniel came back that night. Not the next day, that night. At a time he chose deliberately because men like Nathaniel Hart understand that timing is its own weapon. That arriving when people are tired and unprepared, and the dark has made everything feel more uncertain than it did in daylight, is its own form of advantage. Caleb heard the horses coming up the road while he was still at the kitchen table, and he was already standing and reaching for his rifle before the sound fully registered. Through the window, he could see lamplight from the bunkhouse. Hector had the men awake, which meant Hector had expected this too. Stay inside, he said. No, Evelyn said. He turned. They're here for me, she said. I'm not staying inside while... Evelyn, I have been hiding from this man for 8 months, she said. I'm done hiding. He looked at her for half a second. Then he said, stay behind me, and went out. They came through this gate, all 6 of them this time, and Nathaniel was in front with the easy confidence of a man who has already done the math and liked the outcome. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Evelyn standing behind Caleb's left shoulder, and something in his face went through several things in quick succession before settling back to smooth. Evelyn, he said. Come home. She is home, Caleb said. Nathaniel's eyes moved to him. Mr. Mercer, I gave you time to think. I hope you thought carefully. I did, Caleb said. Here's what I thought. You came here with stolen land records and told me they were hers. You told me she was unstable. You told me everything she said was a lie and everything you said was truth. And then you came back at night with 6 men, which is exactly what a man does when he's afraid of what a woman is carrying in a leather satchel. He held Nathaniel's gaze. I've read those documents, every page. And tomorrow morning, I'm writing to Cheyenne to put them in front of a federal marshal, and every name on that list is going to need a lawyer. The silence after that had weight. One of Nathaniel's men moved his hand toward his hip. Pete, from the shadow of the porch, cocked a rifle so loudly in the cold night air that every horse startled. Hector appeared at the left, Denny at the right, the men at Pete's back. Nathaniel looked at the numbers, did the math. The smooth expression thinned. You think this ends well for you, he said. I have lawyers in 3 territories. I have men in the federal land office. You have men whose names are on paper, Caleb said. And once that paper is in the right hands, what you have is a problem. She has made you a fool, Nathaniel said. And there it was, the real voice under the polished one, cold and precise and stripped of its courtesy. A woman with nothing runs to a lonely man and tells him she needs saving, and he falls over himself to be her hero because he hasn't been needed in so long. He's forgotten what it feels like, and she is going to ruin everything you've spent 20 years building, and you are standing there letting her do it. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, she stays here, and any man who wants to take her goes through me first. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without volume, without performance. Just a statement of fact delivered by a man who has already decided and doesn't need anyone's agreement. Nathaniel looked at him for a long time. He looked at the men on the porch, the numbers, the rifles. He looked at Evelyn, who was standing behind Caleb's shoulder, with her chin up and her hands steady. And something crossed his face when he looked at her. Something that was not quite surprise, but close to it. The particular expression of a man who has spent years building the belief that a person is small and findable. That person standing in front of him, not small at all. "This isn't finished," Nathaniel said. "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't. But it's finished for tonight." And then something happened that none of them anticipated. A sound from the road behind Nathaniel's men. Horses. 2 riders coming fast. And in the lamplight as they pulled up, Caleb recognized the badges on their coats, a half second before Hector said it out loud. "Federal Marshals," Hector said. Evelyn's hand found Caleb's arm in the dark, gripped it once hard, and let go. The first marshal pulled up and looked at the assembled scene. 6 men, 4 ranch hands, 2 people at the center of it all, and said to no one in particular, "We received a correspondence regarding fraudulent land transfers in this district. We're looking for a woman named Evelyn Hart." "That's me," Evelyn said, stepping forward. "Ma'am, we understand you may be in possession of documents relevant to an active federal investigation." "I am," she said. 14 of them. I've been waiting 8 months for someone to ask." Nathaniel's voice from behind. "This woman is my wife, and those documents are my private—" "Sir," the second marshal said, not looking at him. "I'm going to ask you to wait." And Nathaniel Hart, for the first time in the entire evening, went quiet. Evelyn looked back at Caleb. He was already looking at her. And in the low lamplight of a cold January night, with 6 of Nathaniel's men and 2 federal marshals and 4 ranch hands, all standing in various degrees of tension around them, Caleb Mercer allowed himself for the first time in a very long time to feel something without immediately finding a way to close it back up. She had written to the marshals herself, weeks ago, before the documents were in any danger, before Nathaniel arrived. She had found the name of a federal investigator known for working outside the Territory Land Office networks, and she had written him a letter, and she had sent it through Denny on the supply run without telling Caleb, because she didn't want him to fight a battle that she had already started fighting on her own. She had not come here to be saved. She had come here to survive long enough to finish what she started. And she had. The marshals took Nathaniel Hart into custody before midnight. He didn't go quietly. Men like him never did. He went through 3 different versions of himself in the space of 10 minutes. First, the smooth businessman explaining a misunderstanding. Then the wronged husband asserting his legal rights. Then, finally, when neither of those worked, the stripped-down version underneath both of them, the one that had always been there, cold and calculating, and suddenly out of moves. He looked at Evelyn once before they put him on a horse. One long look that was meant to communicate something, a threat, a promise. The specific kind of fury a man carries when the person he underestimated finally stops being underestimated. Evelyn looked back at him without moving. That was all. She just looked back. And Nathaniel Hart rode away from the Mercer Ranch in the custody of 2 federal marshals on a cold January night, and Evelyn watched him go. The way you watch something that has had power over you for years finally lose it, not with triumph, not with tears, but with the quiet physical relief of a person who has been holding their breath for so long, they'd almost forgotten what air was supposed to feel like. Caleb was beside her when the horses disappeared down the road. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Hector finally exhaled from somewhere behind them. Pete set his rifle butt against the porch and said to nobody in particular, "Well," which was about as close to an emotional declaration as Pete had ever come, and everyone understood it. Denny said, "Is it over for tonight?" Caleb said. "But the documents." "The marshals have them now," Evelyn said. "Copies. The originals are still safe." She paused. "It won't be over overnight. These things take time in courts, but the investigation has started, and once it starts, men like Nathaniel can't stop it. They can only slow it down." "How do you know that?" Denny asked. She looked at him. "Because I've been planning this for 8 months," she said simply. "I didn't just carry those documents. I memorized them. I know every name, every date, every amount on every line. Whatever they try to destroy, I can reconstruct from memory." He knew that by the end. It's why he came here himself instead of sending someone. Denny stared at her. You memorized 14 legal documents. 16, actually, she said. I left 2 with a lawyer in Laramie before I came west. The porch went completely silent. Hector looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a man encountering a new depth in something he thought he'd already measured. Go to bed, he said to the men. All of you. We'll talk tomorrow. They sat in the kitchen after the men went in. Both of them at the table, the lamp low, the house settling into the particular quiet of a place that has just come down from something. Evelyn had her hands wrapped around a cup. She wasn't drinking from it, just holding it. Caleb was watching her in the way he'd learned to watch her directly, but without pressure, the way you look at something you don't want to startle. 16 documents, he said. I know. A small pause. I should have told you sooner. You should have told me a lot of things sooner. Yes? But you didn't, because I didn't know if I was going to stay, she said. And it seemed wrong to hand someone a weapon and then leave before they understood how to use it. He looked at her. And now? She met his eyes. And now I don't want to leave. The fire was low. Outside the wind had settled, and the night was the kind of still that Wyoming gets in deep winter, an absolute quiet that makes everything inside feel more interior, more real, more unavoidable. I need to ask you something, Caleb said. And I need you to answer it the way you answer everything straight, without managing what I'm going to feel about it. All right, she said. When you came here, when you knocked on that gate, did you know whose ranch this was? Did you know about me specifically? She held his gaze. I knew you were a rancher who kept to himself and had no connection to the railroad investors. I knew your property was outside the main acquisition corridor. I knew you had a reputation for being difficult. She paused. I didn't know anything about you, just the shape of you from the outside. And now I know you eat your supper too fast when you're preoccupied with something. I know you check on the horses when you can't sleep, even if nothing needs checking. I know you put money in an envelope for the Harlow family after their land dispute last fall and told Hector to deliver it without your name on it. She looked at him steadily. I know you put flowers on your parents' graves every spring and then pretend you haven't been out there. I know you still have a book of poetry on your nightstand that belonged to a woman named Rose, and you haven't moved it in 7 years because moving it feels like losing something you're not ready to lose. Caleb's jaw tightened. Denny told you that, he said. Denny told me about Rose, she said. The poetry I found when I was dusting. I put it back exactly where it was. Her voice was careful. Not gentle in a managed way, genuinely careful. I'm not asking you to move it. I'm not asking you to be over anything. I'm telling you that I know who you are. Not the version of you that you show the county. The actual one. He was quiet for a long time. She would have liked you, he said finally. His voice was rough at the edges. Rose. She didn't have much patience for performance either. Evelyn said nothing. She let him have that. I've been afraid, he said, and those 3 words cost him something visible, something he had to push through to get out. For 7 years. Of exactly this. Letting someone matter. Watching them leave or... He stopped. I told myself I was practical, that I'd just made a sensible decision about how to live. But practicality doesn't explain why I came into the kitchen every evening for 2 months. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not a man who's good at... He gestured at the space between them, the whole complicated human architecture of it. This. I'm not either, she said. I'm good at surviving. I'm good at organizing dry storage and memorizing legal documents and walking 3 miles in a blizzard. I am not good at trusting people or needing them or... She stopped herself. But I think I'd rather be bad at it with you than never try it at all. Caleb reached across the table. He put his hand over hers the same as before, and this time he didn't let go. Stay, he said. It came out simpler than he intended. More like something released than something offered. Not as the cook, not as the woman with the documents. Stay because this is where you belong. She turned her hand over under his and held on. Yes, she said. The investigation moved through the winter months, the way legal things do slowly, with a great deal of paper and a great deal of men in offices talking to other men in offices. But it moved. Nathaniel Hart was held in Cheyenne pending federal charges. The 2 judges whose names appeared on the bribe records were suspended within 6 weeks. David Aldridge, the land commissioner, resigned before the inquiry formally reached him, which was widely understood to mean the same as an admission. 3 of the railroad syndicate's partner investors in Denver quietly withdrew their names from the operation before March, which any lawyer would tell you was not an indication of guilt, but which everyone who lived in Wyoming territory understood meant exactly that. The Harlow family got the letter in February from a federal land office representative saying their original survey had been found to contain irregularities and that a review was underway. Old Man Harlow, who had spent the previous winter convinced he was finished, sat on his porch and read that letter 4 times before going inside to tell his wife. The Greers got a similar letter in March. They rode out to the Mercer Ranch specifically to tell Caleb, and Caleb said he was glad to hear it, and offered them coffee and didn't say anything about the woman in the kitchen, who had carried 16 documents across 2 territories in a battered satchel to make it possible. Evelyn heard the conversation through the door and said nothing about it either. But that evening, when Caleb came in and sat down at the kitchen table, she set a cup in front of him and said, "Harlow family." "They're going to be all right," he said. She sat down. "Good." He looked at her across the table. "You did that. The law did that. You put the law in a position to do it," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at her cup. Something in her face went soft in a way that it only did when she wasn't managing it, when she was caught off guard by something that reached her before she could decide how to handle it. She pressed her lips together briefly. "I didn't do it for them specifically," she said. "I did it because it was the only thing I had left that was worth doing." She paused. "But I'm glad it helped them." "It helped a lot of people," Caleb said. "It's going to keep helping people once the full review is complete." He was quiet for a moment. "You understand that, don't you? What you actually did?" "I filed some paperwork," she said. "Evelyn." She looked up. "You ended it," he said. "Whatever Nathaniel was building out here, you ended it. By yourself. Before you had anyone in your corner." She held his gaze. For a moment, something moved across her face that was old and complicated, and had nothing polished about it, the expression of a person being told for what might be the first time that something they did mattered. Not because it was useful to someone, because it was right. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth." Spring arrived in Red Hollow with the particular slow insistence of Wyoming spring, which does not come all at once, but works its way in a few degrees at a time, until one morning you step outside, and the air is different, and the ground is soft, and something in your chest that has been braced against the cold realizes it doesn't have to be braced anymore. Evelyn had planted bulbs along the south side of the barn in November, during the first weeks when she'd been figuring out what was alive on this property and what had been allowed to go dormant. She hadn't said anything about them. She'd just put them in the ground in the spare hour between morning chores and supper working alone, and covered them up and said nothing. They came up in April, yellow first, then white, then a deep rust red that Caleb stopped in front of one morning on his way to the corral and stood looking at for a full minute. Hector came up beside him, looked at the flowers, looked at Caleb looking at the flowers. "She put those in before the first snow," Hector said. "I know." "Before she knew whether she was staying." Caleb said nothing. "She planted something for the spring," Hector said, "before she knew she'd be here to see it." He let that sit. That's a person who was hoping Caleb, even when she was too smart to count on it. Caleb looked at the flowers a moment longer. Then he walked inside. Children started appearing at the ranch in May. Not the ranch hands' children, there weren't any, but the children of neighboring families who had discovered through the particular information network that exists exclusively among children that the kitchen at the Mercer property sometimes produced extraordinary things, and that the woman who ran it was not the kind of adult who told you to go away. The Patterson boys came first. 3 of them, 8 through 12, showing up at the kitchen door on a Saturday morning with some invented errand as cover and staying for 2 hours. Evelyn fed them cornbread and asked them questions about their horses and their schoolwork with the full focused attention of someone who considers what a child says important, and all 3 of them left with the slightly dazed expression of young people who have been taken seriously for the first time. They came back the following Saturday with 2 additional children. Denny, who was barely older than the oldest of them and found this hilarious, started referring to Saturday mornings as the gathering, which made Pete snort and made Caleb say nothing, but look at the kitchen door with an expression that was not his usual expression at all. Hector noticed. He noticed the way Caleb walked through the house differently, now not faster or slower, but with a presence that had been absent. Not the controlled competence of a man managing his property, but the presence of a person who is somewhere they want to be. He noticed the way Caleb had moved Rose's book from the nightstand to the shelf, not removed it, not hidden. It just moved it to a place that was respectful, rather than private. The way you handle a thing you have finally made peace with. He noticed most of all the morning in late May when he walked past the kitchen window and saw Caleb standing at the work table beside Evelyn, watching her show him something about bread dough with the patient precision she brought to everything she knew, and Caleb was smiling. Not a small caught smile that disappeared when noticed, just smiling. Naturally, the way a person smiles when they are in the middle of something ordinary with someone they love and haven't remembered yet to be afraid of it. Hector kept walking. He didn't mention it to anyone. Some things you leave alone. The legal proceedings against Nathaniel Hart concluded in August. Evelyn received a letter from the federal court in Cheyenne informing her that Nathaniel Worthington Hart had been found guilty of bribery fraud and conspiracy to commit land theft across 3 Wyoming counties and had been sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. 2 of his co-investors received lesser sentences. David Aldridge was barred from any public office in the territory for life. Evelyn read the letter at the kitchen table. Then she folded it carefully, set it down, and sat very still for a moment. Caleb came in from outside and saw her face and stopped. "What is it?" She looked up. Her eyes were bright, not with sadness, something else. "It's done," she said. He came to the table and she handed him the letter, and he read it standing up. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it genuinely. "Like a door I've been holding shut for 8 years, finally locked from the outside." She paused. "Like I can put both hands down." He pulled out the chair and sat across from her close. "What do you want to do now?" he said. "All of it. What do you actually want?" She looked at him. It was such a simple question. It was the question nobody had asked her in so long that she'd stopped expecting anyone to ask it. "I want to stay here," she said. "I want to plant things in the spring and know I'll see them come up. I want to teach Denny how to keep accounts so he has more options when he's ready. I want to send something to the Harlow family when they get their land back." She looked at her hands on the table. "I want to stop building exits before I've decided whether to stay." "That sounds like a plan," he said. "It sounds like a life," she said quietly. He reached across and covered her hands with his. "Those are the same thing," he said. On a Sunday evening in September, with the last of the summer light coming through the kitchen window, long and gold, Caleb Mercer asked Evelyn Hart to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not prepare a speech or choose a significant location or wait for a moment that felt weighted enough to carry the thing properly. He did it the way he did everything that mattered directly without performance, while she was in the middle of doing something else. She was at the work table. He came up behind her and said her name, and she turned around and he said, "Marry me." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'm not going to change my mind. I'm not going to get afraid and close back up and decide this was a mistake. I've been living in this house for 20 years, and I've been afraid in it for 7, and I am done." His voice was even. Sure. The voice of a man who has finished an argument he was having with himself and arrived at the end of it. "I love you. You know I love you. And I want you to be here in the way that means you can't leave without a conversation." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were doing that thing, the edges going bright, the careful steadiness cracking just slightly at the seams. "You think a marriage license will stop me from leaving," she said. "No," he said. "I think you asking for one will." She was quiet. "I asked you," she said carefully, "what you would do if I said yes. I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never had a reason to regret it," he said simply. "And I'd expect you to do the same." She looked at him for a long moment. He held it, no fidgeting, no added reassurance, no walking back from the thing. Just a man standing in his kitchen, waiting for the answer with the patience of someone who is not afraid of the waiting. "Yes," she said. He didn't sweep her up or make a production of it. He stepped forward and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her in private for months, with the full weight of a person who has finally stopped protecting himself from the risk of another person, and kissed her once slowly, as if they had time. As if time was something they owned now. And they did. People in Red Hollow talked about the Mercer Ranch differently after that. Not right away, these things take the time they take, but gradually across the seasons. The way you talk about a place that has changed in ways you can't fully explain, but can feel when you stand near it. They talked about the flowers along the south barn wall. About the Patterson boys, who seemed to have semi-permanent residence at the kitchen table on Saturdays. About Denny, who by the following spring had become the youngest man in the county to pass the territorial bookkeeping examination. Something he mentioned with appropriate modesty and total inability to hide his pride. About old Pete, who had started talking more. Not a lot more. Pete would never be a lot, but enough that people who had known him for 20 years did occasional double takes when he offered an opinion at the general store. They talked about Caleb Mercer smiling. Not often. He was not a man who would ever be described as cheerful. That was too far from his nature, and probably always would be. But there was a difference now between the silence he wore when he came to town for supplies and the silence he used to wear, and everyone who'd known him long enough felt it without being able to say exactly what it was. Hector could have told them. Hector knew exactly what it was. It was the silence of a man who is quiet because he's content, not because he's empty. There is a world of difference between those two things. Most people never learn the difference. Caleb Mercer had spent 7 years on the wrong side of it and come back, and that was no small thing. And the people of Red Hollow, Wyoming, who could not have told you any of this in words, understood it in the way communities understand the health of the people they're built from in their bones, in their daily habits, in the way the air around the Mercer Ranch sat differently come spring. The last thing Evelyn planted that first year was a rose bush. She put it at the north edge of the property near the graves. Not a grand gesture, just one plant set carefully in the ground with both hands pressed in firm the way you press something in when you mean it to stay. Caleb found her there in the late afternoon and stood at a distance and watched. She finished, stood up, looked at the graves, looked at the rose bush, and then looked at him. "I thought it belonged here," she said. He walked over and stood beside her, looked at the plant, at the graves, at the woman standing in his life like she'd grown there. "Yes," he said. "It does." He took her hand. They walked back to the house together, and behind them the evening came down over the Wyoming plain, in that wide, unhurried way it does when the season is right, and the lights were already on in the kitchen. And somewhere inside, Denny was telling Pete something that made Pete actually laugh, and the sound of it carried all the way out to the north fence and beyond. Some people believed love was supposed to arrive like lightning, sudden and blinding, and impossible to mistake. Caleb Mercer had believed that once, and then he'd stopped believing in most things for a long time. But love, the real kind, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it comes in through the side door on a blizzard night in a torn coat, asking only for honest work. Sometimes it repairs what is broken without being asked, and leaves flowers at graves that no one has visited in years, and reads geography books alone by firelight, and asks you whether you'd rather look at horses or mountains, and then ignores your answer in favor of rain, which was never one of the options. And sometimes the coldest heart in a county is not cold at all. It is simply a heart that has been waiting without knowing. It was waiting for someone safe enough to finally come close. Caleb Mercer had found her. He was not letting go.